Okay. So I need to record this conference to the cloud according to the requirement of the conference organizer. Okay, everyone. Okay. So I think we should just start. Maybe the other speakers will just join us a bit later. Hello, everyone. This is the best paper session 9. I understand one of those that has the international focus. So we do have 3 very interesting papers that have focused on different countries, different important countries in the world. But as I understand, one of the speakers, Mr. Weihao, he has some family issues that he cannot join us today. So we'll see if we can figure out ways that he can share his research with us in the future. But I think we have 2 other speakers that do very interesting research. So my name is Zhang. I am a Cornell IR alumnus, and I now work as an assistant professor at Renmin University of China. So here at Beijing, it's already the midnight, but I still feel quite excited about all the papers that we have in this session. So firstly, maybe we should have Mr. Salil Sapre. As I understand, he's a PhD student at Michigan State University School of Human Resources and Labor Relations. His research focuses on gender and work, comparative employment relations, informal work, worker mobilization and organization, social movement theory, and the labor implications of the global supply chain, right? So we will today hear from him. It's a very interesting paper, which is titled Going Global but Staying Local, the Mechanics of a Local Labor Control Regime in Export-Oriented Garment Manufacturing in India, right? Okay,
yeah.
Let's welcome.
All right, thank you. I'm going to share my screen real quick.
So according to the conference requirement, we have about 10 minutes for each of our speakers. But since, it seems we have you or maybe Juliana later, so maybe you can have a little bit more time, I think.
Okay.
10
okay, so I can speak for around 15 minutes. Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Thanks for the introduction at the beginning of the session. My name is Salil Sapre. As already mentioned, I'm a PhD candidate at the School of Human Resources and Labor Relations at Michigan State. And my paper is about the mechanics of local labor control regimes in the Indian garment industry. So let's look at the big picture of global garment work to begin with. So we know that the global garment industry does provide employment opportunities, especially to women. But most of these jobs are marked by social downgrading and labor exploitation. However, local level dynamics of labor control still remain relatively under-researched. So I'll talk about the garment industrial context real quick. So the industry is characterized by a consolidation of buyers, and most of these international contractual relationships are buyer-driven. The global garment workforce is highly feminized, and the employment relationship in the industry is marked by gendered prejudices, such as women have nimble fingers, they are docile, and they're less likely to unionize. And the industry also witnesses a stark absence of mainstream unions. So what do we really mean by local labor control? So local labor control is a contested terrain on which capital, labor, and other mediating institutions compete to achieve outcomes suitable to their interests. However, we know that local level garment suppliers maintain cost competitiveness through a regulation of labor at the local level. So we know the what. But in important garment exporting hubs such as India, more attention needs to be paid to how these local labor dynamics play out. Also, the literature in the global supply chain context focuses on either gender or migration status, but intersectional analyses of migrant women's experiences still remain somewhat under-researched. In addition, there's been an inordinate focus on firm practices, and that has been problematized by some scholars, although new work does discuss a collective institutionalized labor agency. Some scholars in India have examined how individualized, even non-confrontational agency of within state migrants takes place. So for those of us who might not be aware of the context, India is a huge country with about 26 officially recognized languages. And each state has its own language, roughly speaking. So going from one state to another is like going to another country, culturally speaking. So given this context, there's a need to focus on the experiences and agencies of interstate migrants as opposed to within state, and as well as how their agency co-creates these local level dynamics. So essentially what I do here is I investigate how local labor control in India plays out. Uh, I also examine migrant women's experiences using an intersectional approach, and I interrogate their agency as well, and different manifestations thereof. So this work is anchored in the local labor control regime or LLCR framework. So what exactly is an LLCR? So an LLCR encapsulates the gamut of practices, norms, behaviors, and cultures. And these practices are extremely sensitive to time and space. Each LLCR also comprises three spheres of existence, or locales as they are called. So the first one is reproduction, the second one is production, and third one is commodity consumption locales. And these are held together by locally unique institutions and social relationships, which are extremely contentious in nature. So these are the research questions I'm looking at. First, I ask how local labor capital power dynamics play out at the grassroots level. Second, I'm interested in understanding how intersecting social identities of workers influence their experiences of subordination. And I ask this question with respect to interstate female migrant workers in this LLCR. And third, I look at how their agency impacts local capitalist relations in the industry. So this work borrows from my field work that I did in the South Indian Garment Industrial Hub over each summer from 2017 through 2019. I worked with two civil society organizations and a union. I collected data in the form of interviews, observations, and a number of secondary sources. My data collection uh, it engaged with Michael Burowa's extended case method and borrowed a lot from that. I also use an intersectionality approach, as I mentioned earlier, from an individual group subjectivity standpoint. So talking about the research setting briefly, so this was a huge industrial pocket with more than 1,000 factories. The garment work was mostly tailorized and feminized. Work organization was highly gendered in that the managerial staff was male and line workers were more likely to be female. The workforce was around 600,000 strong, and a huge proportion of this workforce was native born workers, and 10% were Hindi speaking migrant workers who had come in from northern and northeast Indian states, and their proportion had been expanding, had been growing rapidly in the industry. So digging deeper into the situation of the migrants. So these workers were around 60,000 strong at the time of this research. Most of them were women. They were extremely young. Many belonged to agrarian backgrounds, and their families experienced economic uncertainties throughout the year. In the host region, they lived in employer-provided hostels, which were subjected to stringent surveillance and spatial control. They also experienced a huge turnover because most of them left after their economic goals, such as siblings, education, or saving for their own weddings, were satisfied. And they also experienced a language barrier in the host region, as I indicated earlier. So let's move on to discussing the first locale, the workforce reproduction locale. So This speaks to the importance of workers' backgrounds, their innate or acquired skills, recruitment practices, as well as social reproduction dynamics in these spaces. So the government of India had partnered with a private firm, and together they had set up recruitment centers in northern and east Indian states. And most of these centers specifically targeted women from young women from economically weak backgrounds. Once they were trained, they were sent over to the South Indian garment hubs. In the host region, as I said, they lived in hostels, and these hostels were supervised by wardens. And these spaces were also subjected to surveillance practices such as curfew hours, restrictions on cell phone use and socialization. And interestingly, oftentimes personnel accompanied these workers while transiting from the hostel to the factory and back in order to prevent their interaction with unionists on the way. So there's a quote I have here. In the interest of time, perhaps I can come back to it later. So I argue that we cannot see workers as passive victims of workplace exploitation, and we need to talk about their agency and various manifestations thereof. So here I argue that the decision to migrate itself is a form of individualized agency because it ensures worker availability for government employers, right? So here we have agency which is individualized, it's non-institutionalized and non-confrontational. I'll discuss what these terms mean in a bit. So when workers were recruited in the industry, they also reached out to other folks in their social networks and asked, their cousins or even friends to get employed in the industry. So these individuals then became easy recruits for these recruiters. Also, as I mentioned, the turnover rate for migrants were extremely high, right? So recruiting agents, they recruited throughout the year. So they were engaged in continual recruitment all year round. Some workers also were involved in clandestine romantic affairs with co-workers, and they also engaged in covert union activities. And if and when these activities came to light, these workers were subjected to even stringent, tighter surveillance in hostels. So we can see how worker agency affected employer practices and how together they co-constituted practices within this LLCR. Moving to the next locale, this is about power dynamics at the point of production. So we know that almost all garment workers are susceptible to exploitation, but migrant workers are even more so. So for instance, this migrant woman speaks about her experiences being dehumanized at the workplace. Again, I can come back to this at the end if that's all right. So factory managements employed three types of strategies vis-a-vis migrant women. So the first one was monetary. So migrant women made the least amount of wages as compared to other worker groups. The second strategy was interpersonal, and interviewees referred to this as production torture. Of course, there was surveillance and intimidation, but there were other peculiar practices as well. For instance, some migrant women explained how supervisors would just walk in, snatch away the workers' cell phones, and look at their texts or try to see if they're engaging with any unionists, right? And interestingly, this intrusion into workers' privacy happened only for migrant women. Many of these supervisors, pressured workers to meet production demands, and when that did not happen, they engaged in, verbal abuse, and they did so in their native language. But because of the language barrier, migrants did not understand what the supervisors were saying, and they knew that they were being abused, but they could not answer back. So these were really humiliating experiences for these workers. And as is quite well known, garment employers are extremely antagonistic to unions, but if migrant women engaged in unionism, they faced really severe consequences. For instance, they were evicted from hostels, and these were really young women, right? So being kicked out of the hostel in a region full of strangers was nothing short of traumatic for them. Nonetheless, they did exhibit various forms of agency. So the circle that we have on the left top here, this is a case wherein a factory announced that they would close down, but they had not paid wages to the workers for a long time. So migrant women came together with native born workers, and together they organized sit-ins for days together in the factory, if not weeks. Ultimately, they got their wages owed. So we can see that this agency was a manifestation of collective forms of agency, although it was non-institutionalized, because these were informal worker collectives. This was not through a union. And the agency was also confrontational. Some workers also were members of unions, and when they faced abuse at the workplace, they dragged the employer to the court, and legal battles and other settlements ensued. So this form of agency, we can see, was collective. It was institutionalized because it happened through a union, and it was also confrontational. At the workplace, workers faced exploitation, out of which and common social and emotional ties rooted in these common experiences of exploitation also emerged. But in many cases, workers did not choose to do anything about it. So in a sense, those their agency to not act kind of perpetuated the status quo. There were also informal worker groups that emerged out of these common experiences, and they lodged complaints against abusive supervisors to the upper managements, in which case the supervisors were reassigned to other production lines, or they were shunted out to other factories, but they were seldom terminated. But we can nonetheless see how worker agency affected employer practices and how they co-constituted these LLCR dynamics. The last locale we have here is the consumption locale, and this speaks to physical living conditions and worker attitudes. So the hostels in which these workers lived charged relatively lower rents, but they had extremely poor living conditions. They were overcrowded, and they lacked basic civic amenities like clean drinking water, power, or even kitchens for that matter. Employers and wardens also shaped worker attitudes in peculiar ways. They propagated narratives that these hostels were safe and secure spaces. They portrayed themselves as local guardians to these workers. And interestingly, most of the migrant women internalized and accepted these views. Nonetheless, they did express agency at the workplace, or within this locale. For instance, they always navigated a trade-off between better working conditions and cheaper rents. So if they made demands of the employer for better working conditions, the employer threatened them with higher wages. So in many cases, they did not raise those grievances. And again, that helped in maintaining the status quo. And in a sense, that was also how this LLCR dynamics, the dynamics within this LLCR were co-created essentially by a worker agency. So in conclusion, I've examined how distinctive local dynamics played out in a relatively under-researched setting. I focused on a unique group of workers, that is interstate migrant female workers. I've also interrogated labor control practices within this LLCR, specifically how the subordination of these workers was reinforced, and I did so using an intersectionality approach. I've also examined various manifestations of worker agency and how employer practices and worker agency together constitute LLCR dynamics, and how these unique dynamics can explain regional variation in global capitalist development. From a practical perspective, this shows that not all manifestations of agency are confrontational, and this has important lessons for unions as to how they could engage with these workers in terms of identifying potential leaders, or even training practices. And this also has important implications for framing policy, as well as better enforcement of existing policy that speaks to the interest of the most marginalized workers. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much for the very interesting presentation. So do we have Juliana in the room now? Okay, I think then we probably have to meet two of our speakers. Then we'll have, this is the only presentation we have in this session now. So I guess we'll just start collecting questions, because this is a really interesting presentation. I myself have many questions, but I will just start collecting questions from the audience first. We'll have plenty of time for discussion, okay? So anyone want to ask a question or make some comments? Mette, you have anything to ask for your students?
Well, I'll raise a comment, Zhang, if that's okay?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
That's also a question. So first, thank you very much, Salil, for this great presentation. I know the paper quite well, and of course it's there's a lot in there, so it's hard to kind of go over it all in detail because you have a lot of great quotes. But I think what stands out from your paper is kind of combining kind of the structural analysis that a lot of people use in terms of these local labor regimes with the worker agency and really worker-centered part that often is forgotten. And then thinking about these elements such as intersectionality and how that plays out in kind of the reproduction, production, and consumption part. So maybe could you give, I know that you had to go over some of the quotes, but can you give some of, just thinking about the fieldwork that you've done, can you tell us maybe a story that you haven't talked about in your presentation here about what struck you kind of the most, or what you were kind of most touched about when you talked to some of these workers about their situation and how that kind of links with these kind of control regimes, essentially?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. So one thing that stood out to me from talking to these workers and having those conversations was how innovative they were about exercising agency. So one example in particular stands out for me. So this was, I think, in 2018. So I spoke about the hostels, right, in the region. And those hostels, especially the women's hostels, were literally inaccessible zones, not only for researchers, but also for unionists, for obvious reasons. Those were spaces that were also used by the employer to engage in captive audience speeches, because those spaces were out of bounds for other people. But the workers, found innovative ways to let the union into those spaces. So what they did was, some of them had cell phones. So they recorded those conversations, they recorded those employer speeches, and they played them out for the unionists to strategize around what the employer was saying. So I was really struck, and that kind of pushed me into thinking about worker agency as well in these contexts, because most of the literature that we find here is extremely institutionalized. They talk about like global systems of governance, but labor geography in particular was something that I found to be speaking about these microscopic atomized issues, and it gave me an idea to incorporate those debates into this literature. So that was an example, to answer your question, that really struck me and pushed me into thinking about how workers expressed agency, and that they were not passive victims of exploitation that happened there.
Yeah, that's a good point, Salil. And I also like how you in your work really kind of interconnect and go beyond kind of the traditional IR, even though we are interdisciplinary, but you do look at kind of geography, what geographers have said, issues of intersectionality, etc., and then kind of tie it back kind of to work and employment. So yeah, thanks for that.
Any other questions or comments? Okay, maybe I have some, I don't know, comments or questions. So this is really interesting. It reminds me a lot of the research and observation that I personally conducted in the garment manufacturing industry in China 10 years ago. When I was a master's student, we studied the factory regimes, the politics of production, exactly how capital controls labor in different industries, and garment is one of our focuses. And actually, a lot of the details that you found in India actually resembles what we found in China nowadays and before in the same industry, right? It's a highly feminized workplace. A lot of sort of internal migrants, as I understand correctly. In China, the case is the workers are migrants, but within China, right? They come from the rural area of China. So the employer provided dormitories. In your case, it's the hostels, right? But both of them are supervised and monitored by the employers, by the capital, right? So there's a mixture of the production and reproduction processes. So workers have to deal with this this kind of a mix of the things, and the supervised labor movements in China, of course, right? Mm-hmm. So so I guess one of the first questions that I have is for you is, what do you think is sort of the India characteristics here in your story, right? So when I was doing my research, I thought this is so Chinese, right? This is so China. It's the internal migrants, it's the supervised labor movement. This is the dominatory regime of labor control. They are so China, right? But then, when I hear about your story, and if you think about Beverly Silver's, global labor movement story, all these industries, all these capitals start to go around the world. When the labor becomes more expensive, they then go to the next place to exploit the local labor there. But then they just seems to be repeating their labor exploitation, labor control stories, right? So 10 years ago, I thought that is so China, but then, it seems that things are repeating in India, and they're just so similar. When you think about the two countries, they're so different. But when you talk about labor regimes and the production and reproduction processes, they are astonishingly similar, right? So what do you think are the industry story, which I think is more sort of general and transferable, versus the more India story, which is more local, right? Which is your story. So I guess that's one of the questions I have for you.
Yeah, so there's two aspects to this. So the first one is that, there are a number of garment industrial hubs in India, and each of them is different in various ways. For instance, some of the North Indian garment hubs, they have most of their workforce, the majority of workers there are men. And it's quite uncommon in the garment industry because the industry overall is highly feminized, right? There are some other aspects to it as well, which have to do with, specializations of the local workforce. So the northern garment hubs specialize in embroidery. And arguably, there is more home-based work in the northern industrial pockets. I cannot validate this point, but this is based on my general understanding of how things have played out so far. In the south, there are these big factories, and most of the manufactured products are ready-made garments, right? And most of them are tier one industries, if I understand the dynamics correctly, right? And many of those workers in the south, most of them, in fact, are women. Unlike a big garment industrial cluster in the north, which is male-dominated, these are female-dominated. The second aspect to your question has to do with a language barrier. So these workers, they're coming from other states which spoke Hindi. It's the most widely spoken language in India. But people in the south did not necessarily understand or speak that language. So that made their oppression even worse. It exacerbated, some of the dynamics that we see within the hostels. For instance, hostel staff could not interact with the residents in the hostel. So they use sign language, or sometimes they abuse, but just fail to have to find a common platform to interact with those workers. So they were kind of infantilized, is what workers have told me, because the staff would be so frustrated they could just not talk because of the language barrier. So to answer your question, in a general sense, those two things come to mind, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, it makes sense. So do we have other audience want to ask a question or make some comments, or I'll just continue? Any other questions?
Stephen, are you muted?
It's like not muted, but we can't hear you.
yeah, this the microphone is not working, I think.
Take the headset off. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that. I'm multitasking on my iPad because I had to get lunch. And my apologies, Salil. I was listening mostly to your paper, not looking at the screen because I was multitasking. But what struck me was I'm using videos of Nike from Indonesia and Joe Fresh and Bangladesh and some of these garment industries in my ethics class. It doesn't seem like there's a labor council, and like the footage from Indonesia, anybody trying to organize a labor movement of any sort or leaders, they get beat and there's security thugs, and Nike kind of looks the other way. In Bangladesh, the health and safety was so horrible. They had the big building collapse and things. So it seemed like with the labor council model, even though they had to resort to sit down strikes and things, at least it seems like they had more voice in the and with the employer and these middle parties than the experience I'd seen in Indonesia and in Bangladesh. So I wanted your opinion if that's correct or if I was reading what you were saying incorrectly. And secondly, is there a video that you would recommend that I could use for India to complement maybe the Labor Council piece that you're talking about?
To answer your second question first, to be honest, I've struggled to find videos. There are a lot of articles, but I'm not sure if there are videos that speak to the issue that you just mentioned. Speaking about your first question, I'll give you an example. Recently, in the beginning of this year, a worker in one of the South Indian garment hubs was raped and murdered, and she worked at a factory that supplied garments to H&M and Gap, right? So Labor Behind the Label or the Clean Clothes campaign, they ran massive campaigns, but we do not see anything happening on the ground. Her family was monetarily compensated, and I mean they organized vigils and whatnot, but when it comes to accountability, we don't have much to say about that. So in that sense, what you see in other countries is quite similar to what's happening in the Indian context as well, if that.
Well, I'm really sorry to hear that. I know abuse of women's been in the news quite a bit over the last few years, but I hadn't made that connection to the workplace. It seemed to be more family or gang related, but I guess, society on the outside versus in the garment sector it's going to be intertwined. But anyway, so I guess my interpretation that it was more positive than what I had thought was incorrect. So thanks for clarifying that, unfortunately.
Okay, more questions?
Well, I don't know if I have an apology because I was also confused when I was supposed to have lunch, and the last session went late. So when I jumped on, I thought you were going to go third, and so I just heard like the last 2 minutes. So I apologize for that, but it's a fascinating topic. I don't know if is the paper posted? Is it available on the website?
It's still in the about to fit in the next few days.
If you could send it to
it's
a
not
copy.
yet posted.
Yeah, if you could send it a copy, that would be wonderful.
I could.
Yeah. I did some research in India, and so just know a little bit about it. But I think a lot about these questions of all different forms of resistance. I think what you said is so right. I felt like I was going to two different countries when I went from Delhi to Bangalore. The factory structure, the gender composition, the migrant worker composition was very different. It was just really incredibly different dynamics. But I don't know what to do with it. But the one story, well, two stories I'll tell. One is when I finally got in to talk to the migrant workers in Bangalore, which was very difficult. It was late evening in their hostel we got in. The language issue was true. And the other part of the language issue was for the organizers, because you had the local organizers had to have translation to talk to the workers. So it affects unions' ability to organize. But what struck me when I talked to the women, they're younger. They tended to be younger than the local women that were in the factories. Their whole strategy was to survive 5 years, save up money, and go back to the villages and move on, with their lives and marriage and so on, and which apparently, right, motivated this massive strike wave when they tried to change the I don't know, it was like severance system where you got paid when you left work, and you had to hold on to it to your lifetime of work, and because their whole life strategy was being challenged, and what some people thought maybe was a more passive workforce had one of the biggest strike waves in recent history in India. So it was really quite dramatic. So I think of that story, and on the other end, I think of a story. A woman we got in, we were talking to her in her home, and we're just talking about survival strategies. And she told the story how she was so exhausted once, or when she's exhausted, but she'll do things like she puts on a sweater and it's hot and it makes her sweat. And then she goes to work and tells HR that she's very sick, and they can see she's sick because she's sweating. And then she gets health leave and she goes home. But there's these, from those like everyday forms of resistance and a sense of, she smiled when she told the story, like this sense of cleverness on her part to trick HR and get the medical leave she wanted, and that sense of, so it wasn't just she got to rest, but she felt this at an emotional, psychological level, a sense of satisfaction. So those stories strike me. The other things that when I think of India, well, too, the embroidery, very big in data, like you said, but it's also, I'm seeing it become automated very quickly. So the home workers are now complaining they're not getting much work. And I saw it in the factories. They download a computer program. These big machines just do the embroidery more and more. The last reflection with India is just what happened with COVID. Was my sense is the migrant workers confused for a period of time. Do they go home? Do they not? Are they locked into the cities? When they eventually got out, they got out, especially Bangalore. It was, you're going from one part of one part of the continent to another. You don't just come back because the next day they put up a poster saying, oh, we're open for business again. So there was a labor shortage at a time that the migrant workers were shut out of work. So it's just some reflections. But again, my apologies for joining late.
Yep, migrant workers also struggle quite because the social welfare system in India is tied to the state of domicile. So if I'm born in state A, my welfare is tied to the state. When they move to another state, they had no access to food grain. Many hostels did not even have kitchens, so there was themselves. So the organizations that I worked with, the NGOs, they were they took up the bills, and they took up the responsibility basically to these workers access to food.
Yeah, I mean, this is a very interesting comment about automation, and I was wondering, how much impacted the garment sector overall is with technological changes, and then the second would be about demographics, because you briefly mentioned labor shortages, and could there be an issue where the fertility rate is coming down? And I mean, we saw that in China. I'm not so sure about India, but whether that could change the economic calculus, perhaps for garment producers, but also perhaps even impact labor relations. That maybe it might be harder to contain unionization efforts for these workers. Thank you.
Yeah, that's also a great question. Comment at the same time. There was a paper I recently read I think it was in the Journal of International Political Economy, and they argued that garment manufacturers are somewhat to adopt new technology because the labor that is available for them is so cheap that they don't want to make those capital investments in new technology. So that was just something that kind of intrigued me, and made me think about how this industry, talking about automation, and how Industry 4.0 is going to percolate in this particular industry. So it remains to be highly labor intensive as opposed to intensive.
So, this is really interesting. I kind of related to another questions that I have. I was thinking about the issue of technologies, right? So we always think, the advancement of technology is an approach to industrial upgrading and then social upgrading, hopefully, right? So the garment industry is very special in terms of its difficulty to upgrade its technologies. So you think about the skill of sewing and the knitting. It's not that easy to imitate by machines, right? So if you look at the garment manufacturing workshops 100 years ago, and you look at the workshops nowadays in China and in India, they're just not that different. You still need people to work on the machines, half automated, to sew and to knit, right? So it's just not very easy for this industry to get rid of the manual labor. So this industry is always the first one that is going to be relocated as long as the labor cost is going up. It's the first industry that goes away to an even lower land in terms of labor cost, right? So this happened in the US, in Mexico, and then in East Asian countries, and then in China. And our garment industries nowadays are going away to Bangladesh, to Vietnam, to maybe partly in India, and then some inland part of China as well, to seeking even cheaper labor, because they just can't replace those labor. So I think one of the issues is the incentive. As you said, there's always cheaper labor there. But on the other hand, I think it's also an industry that is very different. It's just not that easy to be upgraded in terms of the technologies. So I guess my question is, what kind of the technologies are being used in Indian garment manufacturing workshops? Because in China, nowadays we have some cases that they are talking about automation, using modern technologies, the big data, cloud computation, blockchain, all those new terms to upgrade this industry. But if you look at their production lines, it's just not that different. It's all these fancy things, but doesn't really make manufacturing workers, the frontier workers, better off. They still need to be there to operate the machines. So I just wonder, what are the technologies that you observe in India in this industry, and anything promising for industrial upgrading for this industry?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the question. So to begin with, I will say that I'm not sure if I'm qualified enough to answer that question. I could not get access to the factories. So my understanding of dynamics at the secondhand information, right? But I will say, build off of your previous comment about automation. So most of these suppliers, they supply to multiple brands, right? So their end product is customized to the brand that they are serving. It's really tricky and difficult for them to have these, capital intensive, to have the capital intensive machinery in place and try to customize, garments to various brands, right? Because you don't have that standard. It's all, linked to, specific customer specifications. So that also makes capital intensive systems within the factory a bit more challenging.
Okay. So we have more questions.
I could, if there's more, I could maybe just offer also some reflections on this, because it comes up so much now. I think my experience is the final sewing, which is the hardest to automate. But inside the factories, what I'm seeing is automation in other areas. So I mentioned embroidery. The other is cutting. It used to be just simple cut, make, and trim assembly production. And then about 15 years ago, you couldn't do an order with a big brand unless you also purchased the fabric and cut it and prepared it. Before you actually get it shipped to you cut, you would just like assemble a kit. So I would see factories where literally like you spread out all the, and these are the highly skilled workers in the garment factories, sheet after sheet, and like young guys, and this is very gendered, the guys would do this squatting with like these jigsaws and cutting out the patterns. And that was highly skilled. And if you messed up, you cost the company a lot of money because you cut the wrong way, and all that fabric, which is very expensive to cut. So strategically, often they tried to unionize those workers first. But that's been automated, even machines that lay out the factory. And now you could plug in a computer code and the cutting is done by machines. And that's a huge change. And again, I've seen the embroidery, they download programs. And the other part, we always talk about cost in the garment industry. I thought it's also speed to market. So I think the issue with the home workers and the embroidery was you had to get the orders in, bundle up these small things and get them out to the homes. Women and young children would sit on the floor embroidery. Then you had to packet it up, bring it back in, get it into the assembly line, get it sewn in. So there was an incentive for speed to market to automate embroidery. So that's right. And digital during COVID, digital 3D prototypes have become very, very big. So you used to ship the orders back and the prototypes, and in New York, they'd feel the fabric, they'd look at it, a model would wear it. They would, now they're doing that with like these avatars. It happened very quickly, that digital, and it cut, again, it was a speed to market issue, which is as important as pricing. I just say with speed to market, what it means is, if you forecast out really long in advance and you get it wrong, you're discounting maybe by 40% the garments you can't sell. So if you shorten that time and you could sell most of your product at full price, it's, you're saving as much, if not more money than by squeezing down workers by a few cents. So they're obsessed with price and speed to market. I don't know if that helps it.
Yep. Thanks for the reflections, Mark.
Okay, so I see another speaker of us, Juliana, just joined our room. Hello, Juliana.
Hello.
Hi, how are you?
Nice to meet you.
We finally have you. So I think we just have 10 minutes. And I think that is for your presentation. Perfect timing.
Oh my God, but I saw 2030. That's why I'm entering just right now.
Yeah,
2030 to 1:30. That's why.
Yeah, we started at 12:30, but we didn't have you at the beginning. So we started from Salil's presentation. We have a good discussion. So you want to present your paper now?
If everyone wants to, like, I'm sorry, because I'm Madison, Wisconsin. Here is 2020, 12:20. That's okay. I think there's no time, but it seems like there is a mistake.
Okay. Yeah, sure. Yeah,
I can present around 10 minutes if you
sure.
able.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm gonna share my screen.
Okay.
Have you seen?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, just beginning here. Okay, perfect. So my name is Juliana Brandao. Sorry about this misunderstanding. I'm a PhD dissertator at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'm gonna present my PhD dissertation in July, I think in a month. My theme is about strategies for reducing modern slave labor in the cattle supply chain in the Brazilian Amazon. First of all, the definition of modern slave labor, MSL, established the idea of employers treating workers as goods, demanding long working hours, applying degrading working conditions, restricting workers' freedoms via debt plumage, or via physical or psychological threat. What I mean is that I took these pictures from internet. The accommodations like this sharks here, the workers do not have beds, like mattress, this kind of thing. And the toilets usually is a big hole in the ground. And they don't have drinking water. It's just an example here. The context. The Brazilian Amazon, which is highlighted in the bold line in the north part of Brazil, has around 75% of all MSL cases in Brazil, and 4 out of 5 of these cases are related to cattle ranching. And my area of study, the state of Pará, which is highlighted in red, which has around 30% of all MSL cases related to cattle ranching in the Brazilian Amazon, in Brazil as a whole, sorry. And how Brazil is confronting with this problem is through public sector initiatives and private sector initiatives. The public sector initiatives that I'm gonna look at are the dirty list and the penal code, and the private sector are the 2 commitments made with the federal prosecutors and the Greenpeace. And the goal is to investigate the 2 initiatives in the Brazilian Amazon to reduce MSL within the cattle sector. And my main questions are the difference between the dirty list and the penal code, the difference between the commitments made with the Greenpeace and the federal prosecutors, and the strengths and weaknesses of each of these initiatives. I'm going to be very brief because it's a very complex analysis. And the dirty list is the last step of the Ministry of Labor procedure, which begins with the denouncement usually made by whistleblowers that call to the Ministry of Labor saying, I don't think that the cattle rancher is treating good these workers, which means like, I think that the cattle ranchers are violating the dignity and freedom of the workers in this field here. And then the Ministry of Labor will send some labor agents to the field to investigate if this denouncement is true or not. And then these labor agents, they will wrap up all the investigation in the road report, and the cattle rancher will have opportunity to defend. And the Ministry of Labor will then look at the reports and the defense and say, okay, if I understand that you press MSL, you're gonna be put in the big list that the whole society can access to know that you were MSL practitioner. And the penalty for being dirty listed is that the cattle rancher cannot borrow money from banks. And besides the naming shame, because many people do not want to be associated with the cattle rancher that is dirty listed. And the other procedure I'm going to look at the penal code is the federal criminal courts, in which I'm going to investigate the first decision of this criminal court. The federal prosecutors, they will look at the dirty list, and they will go after these cattle ranchers to try to penalize them criminally, which means they try to send them to jail for 2 or 8 years and imposition of a fine. The data that I'm going to look to know the comparisons between the dirty lists and the penal code is are the 40 investigation reports where I know the violations, if these people were dirty listed or not, and the conditions under which the workers were submitted. And the other part is the criminal court. I'm looking at the first decision, which is the sentencing. So I'm looking at what were the outcomes in terms of criminal court from these 40 people that were investigated. So my main results here is that under the Ministry of Labor procedure, around 60% of these 40 people that were investigated, that I had data, they were dirty listed, and not even 50% of the people that I look at were convicted under the criminal code, the criminal court. It means that we have much more people dirty listed than go to jail. And in terms of violations, both of the procedure, the Ministry of Labor procedure and the criminal court procedure, they're gonna look at the dignity and freedom of the workers. If we see violations, they will put much more attention on that. And usually from the Ministry of Labor, the cattle rancher who offend dignity and freedom of the worker, they go to the dirty list. But it's not so true for the criminal court, because even though it's the main point to have a claim, is to use or to have a debate of the offense against dignity and freedom, but the interpretation sometimes of each judge, it's not the same. What I mean is that for acquittals, what I saw is that, okay, you cattle rancher may not provide housing, accommodations, beds, drinking water, toilets to the workers. But what we are doing actually is just reproducing the poor lifestyle of these workers. And it doesn't mean that you are a bad person. It's just reproducing the poor lifestyle. That's why you deserve to be acquitted. And the other judge say, but I don't think that we need to take the poor lifestyle as a pattern. We need to take the average society as a pattern that usually everyone has toilets, drinking water, beds, kind of stuff, housing. And if you cattle rancher doesn't provide this structure, you are treating workers as goods. That's why you are a mean person, you are a bad person, and that's why you need to be convicted and go to jail. In terms of the private initiatives, I'm going to summarize here because it's a very detailed circumstance, but we have two, the Greenpeace cattle agreements and the agreements made with the federal prosecutors and hundreds of meat packers in Brazil. The Greenpeace just say, okay, the four main meat packers in Brazil, JBS, Minerva, Mafrig, and Bertin, you should comprise themselves to not trade in cattle with properties that were dirty listed. And the federal prosecutors asked more. The federal prosecutor said, all of your slaughterhouses, including the four main meat packers, shouldn't buy cattle from properties that were dirty listed and also have criminal lawsuits and civil lawsuits. But the point is that after analyzing all the documents, I saw that the Greenpeace cattle agreements, especially the Greenpeace and the four main meat packers, they are very well committed to comply with this only single provision, which is to not trade in cattle with cattle rancher that were dirty listed. But the thing is that the federal prosecutors' commitments, they do not monitor the provision related to criminal and civil lawsuit. They only monitor if the slaughterhouses are complying with the dirty list provision. And in fact, in practice, these both agreements, they are the same. They only look at the dirty list. They don't look at the criminal lawsuit or civil lawsuit. So why do we need a federal prosecutors agreement, right? And in terms of weaknesses and strengths, the positive point of the dirty list is the transparency, because as I said, not everyone wants to be associated with someone that are dirty listed. And the one constraint that I saw is that the reliance on whistleblowers is very prejudicial, because in terms of legal Amazon, Brazilian Amazon, we have more than 100,000 cattle farmers. So you can imagine 40 only investigation taking place in an area that is uncountable, like more than 100,000 cattle farms. It's almost nothing. In terms of penal code, it's good because we have much more severe penalty, like to go to jail and position of a fine. But the legal consciousness of the judge, which means the different interpretation to the same fact, it's something that for me, it's not so good. It's a negative point. And in terms of the commitment with the federal prosecutors and the Greenpeace, the good point is that it brings the market to the discussion about how to fight against MSL, not rely only on public initiatives. But the dependence on the dirty list is very bad, because sometimes the dirty list is not published, it's not well published, the investigation is not so broad covered. And the conclusion that I'm bringing is that the weakening of public initiatives and failure to monitor private sector agreements, reduce the strategies to reduce the MSL cases in Brazil, especially in the cattle ranching. Thank you.
Thank you, Juliana, for the very interesting presentation. So actually, I think we already run out of our time. So I just wonder if anyone in the audience really want to ask a question. Otherwise, I think we should just close the session. And if you have more questions in the future, you can just address it directly to Juliana.
Yeah, and if you have a question, also email me, and
yeah.
I'm happy to share this knowledge with everyone.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much for the great presentations, our speakers, and thank you for all the questions, comments from the audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great panel. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
I have to go sleep now. It's midnight in Beijing.
Sleep well.
Bye. Thank you.